Irrelevant. He has no legal representation. Proceed to the next case. The prosecutor dismissed the elderly man with contempt as guards escorted him into the courtroom in restraints. His posture defeated, his shirt still bearing rusty bloodstains. He remained silent, offered no resistance, and simply took his seat at the defense table in solitude until the entryway doors burst open and a distinguished figure in military regalia strode in, boots echoing, medals gleaming. He paid no attention to the magistrate. He didn't address the spectators. He merely positioned himself beside the elderly man and addressed him as, "Sir, if you believe dignity should remain undiminished with time, please come and stand with dignity below." Samuel Wilson, age 76, had once led an entire parachute battalion in foreign operations. 3 decades earlier, his name had appeared in classified operation reports and commendation documents. Now, it appeared exclusively on a legal docket for interference in defying authorities outside a metropolitan refuge where he had merely attempted to protect a homeless woman from harassment by an aggressive security personnel. The regional media headlines failed to mention his Valor Medal. They omitted his service history or reference to the years he dedicated to instructing recruits after Southeast Asia. They neglected to mention the night terrors that still jolted him awake, or the metal fragments permanently embedded in his right leg. They displayed a booking photograph, blood streaming from his scalp, eye swollen shut. Caption: Drifter confronts officers at women's shelter. The reality: Samuel had intervened between a guard and a terrified woman suffering from trauma due to spousal abuse. The guard had been yelling, insisting she vacate the premises for missing the entrance deadline. Samuel had identified the terror in her expression, the identical look he'd witnessed in villages and trenches decades before. He never raised his fists. He simply positioned himself as a barrier between them, palm extended, speaking soothing phrases he'd acquired from battlefield medics. But when police arrived, they posed no questions. They observed an aged man in tattered clothing, a security officer claiming physical confrontation, and they used electric weapons, forced him into a patrol vehicle when his limbs collapsed. He pushed staff and refused command, the officer stated in documentation. Samuel never disputed it, but nobody inquired about his motivation. Now, 72 hours later, he sat unaccompanied in court. No remaining family to notify, no legal assistance. His appointed defender had abandoned the case earlier that day, overwhelmed and underpaid, muttering about accepting the reduced sentence before rushing to another proceeding. The prosecutor smirked from across the room, files methodically arranged, assurance emanating from his tailored attire. He's been presented with a 90-day compromise. Perhaps he's forgotten. The judge exhaled, growing impatient. Mr. Wilson, do you comprehend the accusations against you? Do you have representation? Samuel remained stoic. He merely gazed at the national emblem above the judge's position. That was the singular element in the chamber he still recognized, still believed in. Mr. Wilson, the judge reiterated. Then the entrance opened. The courtroom turned collectively. A towering figure in complete military attire entered. Silver oak clusters adorning his shoulders, battle ribbons across his chest, a controlled intensity in his expression as he observed the proceedings. Lieutenant Colonel James Mercer, presently commissioned, decorated, esteemed, a man whose mere presence commanded respect without demanding it. Without requesting permission, he proceeded directly to the defense position, seated himself beside Samuel, adjusted his impeccably pressed uniform, and whispered just audibly enough for the front observers to hear, "You instructed me in everything, Command Sergeant Major." "I haven't forgotten." Whispers cascaded through the gallery like wildfire. The judge arched an eyebrow, hand suspended mid-notation. The prosecutor's smug expression wavered for the first time. "Colonel," the judge began, rediscovering her voice, "may I inquire about your purpose in my courtroom?" "I'm supporting the individual who once preserved my existence," Mercer responded, voice unwavering and distinct. "He isn't isolated today, or any day forthcoming." The prosecutor rose abruptly. "Your Honor, this is completely irregular. The colonel lacks legal credentials. He cannot represent the defendant. I'm not claiming to be his counsel, Mercer clarified. I'm present as a character reference and advocate. I'll be arranging proper representation shortly, but meanwhile I request the court's patience for a brief statement. The prosecutor objected again, citing judicial protocols, procedural regulations, the tardiness of intervention. Objection denied, the judge declared, surprising everyone, including herself. Colonel Mercer may continue. This court values truth, not merely procedure. The colonel stood perfectly erect and delivered a statement that rendered the room completely speechless. He recounted an operation in 1983 deep within hostile territory during a classified assignment. Wilson had guided a wounded squad of 6 soldiers out of an enemy zone after their communications were compromised and extraction became impossible. He traversed 11 miles through dense jungle, injured in the leg and upper body, carrying a young enlisted man on his shoulders. That enlisted man, the colonel's voice faltered momentarily. That enlisted man was myself. Samuel's gaze remained fixed on the table before him, but his posture straightened almost imperceptibly. The colonel produced documentation from a leather folio, a communication from the Defense Department, confirming Samuel's service record, his courage, and decades of mentorship in the reserves training young recruits. This court perceives a lawbreaker, the colonel stated, his voice rising with measured emotion. But I recognize the individual who molded generations of soldiers, who taught us not merely tactics but honor, who demonstrated surviving not just conflict, but peacetime. Audible reactions filled the courtroom. Even the jurors appeared moved, several shifting uneasily in their positions. The judge examined Samuel with fresh perspective. Mr. Wilson, why didn't you disclose your identity when detained? Samuel finally spoke, his voice rough from disuse but steady. I didn't believe it mattered anymore. The colonel shook his head firmly. It perpetually matters. He turned to address the prosecutor directly. The arrest documentation is deficient. The camera footage wasn't scrutinized. The woman he was defending wasn't interviewed. This isn't justice, it's expediency. The prosecutor shuffled papers, suddenly defensive. We follow the evidence provided to us. If mitigating circumstances exist, they do, the colonel interjected, and if you'd look beyond a destitute-appearing veteran, you'd have discovered them. The courtroom had transformed. Where minutes earlier had been routine disinterest, now rested uncomfortable awareness. A journalist in the rear was already typing frantically on her device. An officer near the exit had removed his cap, recognition dawning across his features. Your Honor, the colonel continued, I request this matter be postponed for 48 hours while we secure appropriate counsel and gather evidence that should have been collected days ago. The prosecutor began another objection, but the judge silenced him with an upraised hand. Mr. Wilson, she said, leaning forward, is this accurate? Were you protecting someone? Samuel nodded once. She was experiencing flashbacks. The guard was shouting. I merely intervened. Something shifted in the judge's expression, a softening around the eyes. And you never informed the officers? They never inquired, Your Honor, he replied simply. They merely saw what they anticipated seeing. The colonel placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder. That's been the narrative of his existence since returning home. People observe an elderly man. They don't perceive the hero beneath. The prosecutor cleared his throat. Your Honor, regardless of his previous service, the law, the judge interrupted, is designed to serve justice, not technicalities. Colonel, you have 48 hours. I expect to see evidence, not merely sentiment, when we reconvene. As the gavel descended, Samuel turned to the colonel. You weren't obligated to do this, James. The colonel's response carried through the now silent courtroom. You're correct. I wasn't obligated. I chose to, just as you chose to carry me when you could have saved yourself. If you believe the world needs to hear narratives like this, follow Ironheart Chronicles so no hero fades into obscurity again. The judge suspended proceedings to verify the colonel's assertions. Within 60 minutes, Confirmations arrived through military channels, Veterans Affairs officials, and even a one-star general who personally contacted the judge's office. Samuel Wilson had received 3 citations for valor, including a Distinguished Service Cross. He had instructed ethics, survival, and leadership to more than 2,000 recruits. He had never once sought media recognition or special consideration for his service. And perhaps most damaging to the prosecution's argument, he maintained an exemplary history of diffusing conflicts at veteran support programs where he occasionally volunteered. Colonel Mercer utilized every moment of the 48-hour extension. He assembled a team of 3 attorneys specializing in Veterans Affairs, obtained the complete security footage from the shelter, and located the woman central to the incident. When court reconvened, the gallery was filled to capacity. Veterans in uniform lined the rear wall, standing silently at attention. Journalists occupied the left section. Ordinary citizens filled every remaining seat. The police report underwent meticulous re-examination. The body camera footage, previously overlooked in the filing system, showed Samuel stepping between the woman and guard, arms extended but non-threatening, voice calm, posture defensive rather than aggressive. He intervened peacefully, the colonel emphasized, standing beside the now properly dressed Samuel. He was upholding the pledge he made in 1966 to safeguard those unable to protect themselves. The security guard, when questioned under oath, admitted to yelling at the woman, acknowledged that Samuel never struck him, only positioned himself between them. He kept repeating, "She's experiencing a flashback. Give her room," the guard testified reluctantly. "I might have overreacted when he refused to move." A quiet woman in worn attire rose from the gallery when summoned. "I'm the person he defended," she said, voice barely audible. "I was suffering an anxiety attack." The brightness and shouting triggered memories. He recognized what was happening when nobody else did. He harmed no one. He helped me breathe again. Her testimony confirmed it. The courtroom waited in expectant silence as the judge studied the documentation before her. She removed her spectacles, fixed Samuel with a direct gaze, and spoke. "Charges dismissed with prejudice." She paused. "Command Sergeant Major Samuel Wilson, this court apologizes for failing to recognize your character, for failing to ask the appropriate questions." Samuel blinked, the only outward indication of emotion. "I'm simply grateful someone still sees me." The colonel saluted him, precise and respectful. "They do now, sir." The prosecutor admirably approached Samuel after the gavel fell. "I was mistaken," he said, simply extending his hand. "I should have investigated more thoroughly." Samuel accepted it without hesitation. We all overlook things occasionally. Outside the courtroom, cameras flashed. Samuel appeared uncomfortable with the attention, but the colonel maintained a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You're not obligated to address them," he assured his former commander. But Samuel straightened his borrowed necktie and stepped forward. "I'm not extraordinary," he told the microphones thrust toward him. "I merely acted as any of us would. The significant story isn't about me. It's about how readily we forget to look beneath the surface." The colonel watched proudly as the man who had taught him courage now taught an entire city humility. That evening, the shelter's administrator approached Samuel at the modest celebration the colonel had arranged. "We'd like you to train our personnel," she said, "in recognizing trauma responses and de-escalation. Would you consider it?" For the first time that day, Samuel smiled genuinely. "I would be honored." The colonel observed from across the room as Samuel began conversing animatedly with the shelter staff, hands illustrating concepts in the air, passion returning to his voice. "He's still instructing," noted a young officer who had accompanied the colonel. "He never ceased," the colonel replied. "The world simply stopped listening." That evening, a local news team ran the headline, "Veteran on trial for helping others rescued by former trainee." The following morning, a small gathering waited outside the courthouse. They applauded when Samuel emerged, the colonel still at his side. A child approached him, a small flag clutched in his hand. "My father's a soldier, too. He says you're remarkable." Samuel smiled faintly, kneeling despite protesting joints. "Tell him I merely fulfilled our training. Look after one another. That obligation never expires." Days later, Samuel received a civic commendation for public service. He accepted it not for himself, but for all veterans still waiting to be acknowledged. The shelter where he'd been arrested implemented immediate policy revisions. Within months, it was renamed Wilson House, now a designated sanctuary for trauma survivors with specialized training for all security personnel. The judge sent him a personal letter. Thank you for reminding this courtroom that titles don't define individuals, actions do. That justice requires seeing clearly, not merely following procedure. The police department instituted mandatory training on recognizing and responding to PTSD in civilians and veterans alike. The officer who had arrested Samuel personally attended the initial session that Samuel helped facilitate. The colonel returned to his responsibilities at the base, but every month thereafter he visited Samuel, sometimes bringing young cadets to learn from the man who stood without raising his voice. Samuel never pursued fame or acknowledgement. He still wore the same worn boots, still carried the same quiet dignity. But now when he passed that courthouse, officers stood and acknowledged him, not from obligation or regulation, but because they understood the true victory wasn't in the drop charges or public apology. It was in the quiet transformation that spread through the city's systems and the shelter staff, who now asked different questions, and the police officers who observed more carefully, and the prosecutors who investigated more thoroughly. 6 months after the trial, Samuel moved into a modest office at the Veterans Center, where he counseled those struggling with the same invisible wounds he carried. His schedule filled with appointments, his purpose renewed. "You preserved more than my life that day in the jungle," the colonel told him during a tranquil moment. "You preserved my understanding of what strength truly means." Samuel shook his head. "We preserve each other. That's the only battle worth winning." When asked about his sudden recognition after decades of invisibility, Samuel would simply shrug. "Being seen isn't crucial," he'd say. "Seeing others is." And in a world increasingly blinded by assumption and haste, that lesson stood taller than any medal or commendation ever could. Follow Ironheart Chronicles if you believe no worthy deed and no soldier should ever fade from memory.